Under a burning Arizona sky, the wind moved like breath across the tall grass. Carrying the dust of forgotten wars and the scent of sage that once grew thick around the riverbanks, the land was quiet now, except for the faint sound of a horse's hooves and the whisper of a woman's dress brushing against the earth. She stood there at the edge of the golden field, her dark hair blowing freely, her eyes tracing the line of the distant mountains. Every evening she came to that same place, waiting for a figure who never came. They said the Apache chief had vanished years ago, swallowed by the mountains or claimed by the spirits. Yet she could still feel him in the heat of the wind, in the way the stars leaned close when night fell. No one in the nearby town spoke his name anymore. They called him only the ghost of the plains, the warrior who once rode against the cavalry and disappeared without a trace. But to her, he was not a ghost. He was a promise, a living echo bound to her soul with a vow that time could not erase. We will be together again and again until my legacy lives within you. He had whispered that night by the fire, his words soft but fierce, like an oath carried on the wind. She had never forgotten the sound of it. Even now, when the nights turned cold and the coyotes sang, she felt those words like a pulse beneath her skin. It had begun years earlier. When the war between settlers and tribes reached its bitter height, the army patrols hunted the Apache through the canyons, torching villages and taking captives under the pretense of peace. She had come west with her father, a weary doctor assigned to treat the wounded soldiers. But she had never believed in their cause, not after what she saw. Not after that night when they brought in the prisoners, their hands bound, their pride unbroken. Among them was a man unlike any she had ever seen. His eyes, fierce and still, spoke a language older than the mountains. He did not beg, did not plead. When the soldiers mocked him, he simply stared at the sky, silent and defiant, as though he were speaking to something greater than them all. That night she stole into the camp with a lantern in trembling hands. The wind was cold, and the moon threw pale light over the faces of the captives. When she reached him, he did not move. He only looked at her, and in that moment she felt something shift inside her, as if the earth itself had drawn a breath. She cut his ropes with her father's knife, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear the world around her. "Go," she whispered. But he did not run. Instead, he took her hand and pressed it to his chest, where his heartbeat drummed strong and steady. "You freed me," he said quietly. "Now I carry you with me." By dawn he was gone, and the soldiers found only tracks leading east. She was questioned, accused, and shunned. Her father was reassigned, and she was left behind in the dust of her own choices. The war ended soon after, but peace never truly came. The tribes were driven farther south, their lands taken. Their names turned into stories told around fires by men who didn't know the truth. But she remembered. And when the news reached her that the Apache chief had fallen in a battle near the San Pedro River, she refused to believe it. She rode there herself, through the sun-scorched hills, her horse stumbling beneath her, until she found what remained an abandoned camp. A carved totem, half buried in the sand, and the faint trace of his voice in the wind. For years she lived on that edge between the white world and the red earth, tending a small cabin that once belonged to traders. She grew corn and sage, learned the songs of the land, and spoke to the wind, as if it could answer her. Sometimes, in the silence of the evening, she would feel his presence, the warmth of his hands, the weight of his gaze, the way he used to look at her as if she were not a stranger but a part of his own story. The people in the nearby town thought her mad. They said she was cursed, that the spirits had taken her mind. But she knew better. The chief had made a promise, and his words had not faded with death. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she found something strange near the old well behind her cabin. A small carving made of stone, shaped like two hands joined together, wrapped in a band of leather that was still warm to the touch. Her breath caught. She had seen this before. He used to wear it around his neck, the sign of his lineage, the mark of his tribe's legacy. She fell to her knees, clutching it against her chest. The wind rose suddenly, scattering dust and light across the field, and for a heartbeat, she swore she saw him standing there, tall and strong. The wind in his hair, his eyes burning like the horizon itself. When she blinked, he was gone. But the air still trembled with his voice, whispering those same words that had bound their souls long ago. After that night, the world around her began to change. The nights grew warmer, and her crops flourished even when the rains refused to fall. Wild horses came to drink near her well, unafraid of her presence. The townsfolk whispered that she had made a pact with the spirits, but she no longer cared what they thought. She could feel him near her now, not as a shadow, but as a force woven into the heartbeat of the land. And yet, something deep within her told her the story was not over. There was still something she had to do, some legacy she was meant to carry. One morning she woke to find the sky filled with dark clouds, the air heavy with the scent of rain and fire. From the ridge above her cabin came the echo of drums, slow, rhythmic, ancient. She climbed the hill barefoot, her dress clinging to her legs, her heart pounding like thunder. At the top, she found a circle of stones glowing faintly in the mist. In the center lay a single feather, black as night, and beside it, the print of a bare foot, fresh, deep, impossible. She reached down to touch it, and the world seemed to tilt. The sky dimmed, the wind howled, and she heard his voice again, closer this time, clearer than ever. "You found me," it said, low and trembling. "Now the time has come for you to remember who you are." Her breath caught as the earth began to hum beneath her feet. Visions flashed before her eyes, a fire-lit night, a dance beneath the stars, a warrior lifting her hand to his lips as the tribe sang their vows. And then, the words again, the same ones that had haunted her dreams. "We will be together again and again, until my legacy lives within you," she gasped, tears burning her eyes as light surged through the stones around her. The air shimmered with heat and memory, and for the first time in years, she felt the truth settling deep inside her. This was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of something that reached beyond time, beyond death, beyond the memory of men. As lightning cracked across the plains and the first drops of rain fell, she turned toward the horizon where the mountains met the sky. Somewhere out there, he was waiting not as a ghost, but as a living promise. The legacy he spoke of was not just in the blood, but in the heart. And as the storm gathered around her, she whispered his name into the wind, knowing that he would hear it wherever he was. The thunder answered her call, and the sound of it carried across the valley like a heartbeat, steady and eternal. Leaving the world suspended in the silence that comes before destiny unfolds, the storm passed by dawn, leaving the air heavy and the ground dark with rain. Smoke curled from the chimney of her small cabin, and the scent of wet earth filled the air. She sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the horizon where the night had swallowed the last of the thunder. Her hands still trembled slightly. She could not shake the feeling that something had changed, that the world she had known had quietly turned into something else. On the table lay the black feather she had found in the stone circle, glistening faintly under the weak light of morning. It was more than a sign. It was a call. All her life she had lived between two worlds. Her mother had been born in the East, a woman of gentle manners who taught her to read and sew, while her father belonged to the frontier, a man hardened by years of tending wounds and burying the lost. When she was a child, he would take her on long rides through the plains, pointing out the stars and the sacred places of the land. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried both pride and sorrow. "Remember," he used to tell her, "this land has memories longer than ours. It listens, even when we don't." She never understood what he meant then. But now, sitting there in the silence of the rain, she felt the truth of his words pressing against her chest. The Apache chief had been more than a man to his people. He had been a guardian of their stories, a voice that carried through generations. She remembered the way he spoke of his tribe, not as warriors or outlaws, but as children of the earth. "We do not own the land," he once told her, sitting by the river as the sun bled across the rocks. "We are the breath it takes when it remembers." Those words had stayed with her. Even now, when she walked the field, she could hear them like a quiet hum beneath her feet. After the war, the settlers built new roads that cut through sacred ground. They fenced the valleys and claimed the water for themselves. The old trails faded, and the songs of the people were lost beneath the noise of wagons and gunfire. But she could still sense the presence of what once was, the stories that clung to every stone, every tree, every whisper of wind. It was as if the land itself remembered the chief, waiting for the moment when his spirit would rise again. She spent the next few days tending her crops and mending what the storm had broken. Though her thoughts never left the circle of stones on the ridge, something there called to her, soft and constant, like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Every night she dreamed of fire and drums, of a face half hidden by smoke, of a voice that spoke her name. The dreams felt too real, and when she woke, her pillow was damp with tears she could not explain. The black feather on her table seemed to hum with life, its edges catching the light as though it carried a secret of its own. One evening, while gathering water from the well, she heard footsteps behind her. She froze, gripping the bucket tight. The sun was low, painting the grass in shades of red and gold. When she turned, she saw a figure standing near the old oak, a man dressed in weathered clothes, his hat pulled low over his eyes. His face was partly shadowed, but his voice carried the calm authority of someone who belonged to this land. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "These hills hold things that don't rest easy." She studied him carefully. "I've lived here long enough to know that," she replied, her voice steady. He nodded slowly, stepping closer. His boots left deep prints in the damp earth. The storm stirred up more than rain. "Some of the folks in town say they heard drums last night." "Old drums. Apache drums." Her breath caught. "And what do they say about it?" He shrugged, eyes narrowing. "They say it's a warning. The land remembers what was taken. And maybe it's tired of forgetting." She didn't answer. The man tipped his hat and turned to leave, his figure fading into the distance. But before he disappeared, he looked back once more and said quietly, "If you hear the drums again, don't follow them. Some spirits ain't meant to be called back." That night, she could not sleep. The wind rattled the windows, and in the distance, she thought she heard faint echoes of drumming, deep, slow, and steady, like a heart calling through time. She went outside, barefoot, the ground cool beneath her feet. The sky was full of stars, bright and sharp, and the air smelled of rain and sage. The sound seemed to come from the ridge, the same place where she had found the feather. She hesitated only for a moment before climbing the path. When she reached the top, the world felt still. The circle of stones was glowing faintly, and the air was thick with a strange warmth. She knelt by the center, tracing the outline of the carvings she had missed before, symbols worn by time, but still alive with meaning. Her fingers brushed against one, and a pulse of heat shot through her hand. She gasped, falling back as a whisper filled her ears. "You are the keeper now," it said. "Our blood moves through you." Her eyes burned with tears. "Who are you?" she whispered. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and cedar. "The one you freed," the voice replied. "The one who waits." The air shimmered, and for a brief moment she saw him, the Apache chief, standing before her as real as the night itself. His eyes held the same fire she remembered, his chest bare, his hair braided with feathers and beads. But there was sorrow in his gaze, a weight that seemed older than the earth itself. "Why do you still linger?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because the story is not finished," he said softly. "The promise must be kept. The legacy must live." She tried to step closer, but the air grew heavy, and his image began to fade. "Wait," she cried. "What do you mean?" But the wind swallowed his answer. The light around the stones dimmed, and she was left alone beneath the stars. Her heart pounding with both fear and longing, days turned into weeks. The drumming stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left her. She began to notice signs, markings on trees, footprints near the well. The faint smell of smoke drifting through the valley at night. Someone, or something, was moving through the land. She could not tell if it was meant to protect her or test her. One afternoon, while mending a fence, she found another carving, this one on a piece of driftwood that had washed up by the creek. It was the same symbol from the stone circle, surrounded by patterns she recognized as tribal. When she lifted it, a flash of memory struck her, a scene from years ago, of the chief standing in the rain, pressing a similar carving into her hand. "If you ever lose your way," he had said, "follow the signs carved by the wind." That night she built a small fire outside her cabin and placed the carving beside it. The flames danced, and the shadows seemed to move with purpose. She spoke softly into the darkness. "If you can hear me, tell me what I'm meant to do." The fire flickered, and a gust of wind stirred the embers. For an instant, she thought she heard a voice again, faint but unmistakable. "Look to the mountains," it said. "There lies the beginning." Her pulse quickened. The mountains had always been sacred to his people, the place where their ancestors were said to have been born. She knew that if she went there, she might find the truth or lose herself completely. But something inside her had already decided. The next morning, she packed a small satchel with food, water, and the 2 carvings, and set out toward the mountains that rose like sleeping giants on the horizon. The journey was long, and the land grew wilder the farther she went. Each night, the stars seemed brighter, the air thinner, and her dreams more vivid. She began to see flashes of memory that weren't hers. A battle by the river, firelit ceremony, hands raised to the sky in prayer. It was as if she was walking not only through the desert but through time itself, each step pulling her closer to a destiny she did not yet understand. When she finally reached the base of the mountain, the wind stilled. Before her stood an ancient path carved into the rock, lined with symbols that glowed faintly in the twilight. She hesitated, her hand clutching the feather around her neck. Somewhere above, hidden by the mist, she thought she saw movement, a shadow waiting, watching. And then she heard it again, the steady beat of the drums, echoing from deep within the mountain. It wasn't just sound. It was a heartbeat, calling her forward. She took a breath, stepped onto the path, and felt the ground hum beneath her feet, as if the land itself was awakening. The promise of the Apache chief still lingered in her mind, stronger than ever. "We will be together again and again," he had said. Now, as the sky darkened and the first star rose above the peaks, she understood that his words were not about love alone. They were about destiny. The mountains seemed to breathe as she began to climb, the shadows shifting like unseen hands guiding her way. Every step drew her closer to a truth that waited just beyond the next ridge, a truth that would either set her free or bind her to the land forever. The first stretch of the mountain trail rose like a rib of the earth, tight switchbacks cut into red stone. She moved with slow care, one palm on the rock, the other clutching the feather and the 2 carvings that had led her here. The drums she had heard the night before were quiet now, but the ground still held a soft thrum as if the mountain kept its own steady breath. At a shelf in the rock, she paused. Far below, the plain looked like a faded map. Her cabin was only a speck beside the creek, the golden field a torn cloth laid out under the sky. She thought of the stranger who had warned her, of the town that watched her with a mix of fear and curiosity, but of the chief whose promise had reached across years. She felt both strong and unsteady. It's like a rider on a fresh horse that might bolt without warning. By midday, the sun stood white and hard. The trail narrowed to a ridge and then dipped into a stone throat where the air turned cool. The walls around her were carved with symbols, worn smooth by time and weather. She ran her fingers over the patterns and felt the small ache that comes with touching history you do not fully understand. A flock of ravens swept over the top of the canyon, and she remembered a tribal story the chief had once told her by the river. Ravens were messengers, but also guardians. They carried warnings as well as blessings. She took that as a sign to keep moving. Halfway through the pass, she found evidence that she was not the only person on the mountain. The ashes of a small fire lay under an overhang. Near it were tracks, light and careful, leading deeper into the stone corridor. She crouched to study them. The prints were not from heavy boots. They were from soft-soled shoes or moccasins, the kind worn by those who learned to move without stirring the land. She straightened and turned her ear to the wind. For a moment she thought she heard a voice, but the sound slipped away like water through fingers. She emerged from the pass into a high meadow. The grass there grew in soft waves. A spring bubbled from the base of a black rock, and cottonwoods gathered around it, their leaves chattering in the thin air. She knelt to drink and felt a calm rise through her like a slow flame. This place was not wild in the way of danger. It was wild in the way of sacred ground. She set the carvings on the rock and waited, hoping the mountain would tell her what to do next. As she waited, a second thread of the story tightened below. In town, the stranger who had spoken with her at the well rode into the small square where a survey team had pitched their tents. The men were marking a straight line toward the foothills, iron stakes in their hands, and a folded map on a crate. Their boss, a lean man with a tidy mustache and a voice fit for orders, waved the stranger over. The plan, he said, was simple. A new rail spur would take water from the creek and cut a corridor through the low ridge. The ridge was rich in red stone and copper. The company had contracts, and the county wanted growth. The marshal had already posted notices. The stranger listened with his jaw tight. He knew that line would carve a scar through the old burial paths that ran like veins under the foothills. He also knew the townspeople had been promised wages, new shops, and a school with glass windows. He felt the pull of both futures and wondered which kind of hunger would win. A boy no older than 12 stood near the surveyors, his hat too big for his narrow face. He sold water and jerky to whoever had coins. The stranger knew him. His mother kept the boarding house. The boy tugged at the stranger's sleeve and whispered that folks had seen fire on the ridge after the storm. Not lightning. A circle of fire that burned without smoke. The stranger told the boy to keep his voice low, then stepped away to the shade and weighed what to do. If the crew pushed on, they would cross the sacred line. If the woman on the hill was walking where he believed she was, the old stories might be waking. He decided to ride that evening and find her before the company made its next move. Back on the mountain. The woman rested under the cottonwoods until the light softened. She traced the lines in the carvings. One looked like two hands interlocked. The other was a pattern of arrows turning back upon themselves. She remembered the chief's words. The promise must be kept. The legacy must live. She was not sure what legacy meant in a world that built tracks across graves. Was it children? Was it memory? Was it the courage to stand against a line of men with papers and stakes? The question pressed on her ribs. She followed a deer path around the spring and found a cut in the rock that led to a shallow cave. Inside, the ceiling curved with soot marks. Old ash coated the floor. On the back wall, a figure had been painted with clay and charcoal. A woman stood with one palm on the chest of a warrior. Between them rose a sapling whose roots reached into a river. She felt the pull of tears. It looked like a map of the promise she carried. She reached for the wall and then froze. A soft scuff sounded behind her. A figure stood at the cave mouth. She could only make out the outline at first. A shawl hung over narrow shoulders. When the figure stepped into the dim light, she saw the face of an older woman, weathered and calm, eyes dark as canyon pools. The stranger did not look surprised to see her. Instead, she gave a small nod and pointed to the painting. Her voice was thin but steady. This is a place of keeping. A place where vows do not die. The older woman said the mountain had been waiting. She said the drums had been silent for years until a vow set free was heard again. The older woman did not give a name. The younger did not ask. They spoke quietly, the way people do when the earth around them feels awake. The elder told how the chief had once led his people through these same cuts in the stone, keeping them alive when the valley burned. She told how he had refused a treaty that took water from graves and how he had chosen to vanish rather than carry a false seal. The elder said a vow made at the river had tied him to the woman who freed him. The vow was not a chain. It was a path. When the woman asked what that path required, the elder placed a dry palm over her heart and said that some legacies are carried in the body and others in the work. A person takes up. Both bind, both cost. The elder stepped back into the light and led her along a ledge to a second hollow in the rock. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in faded leather. The elder opened it with care. There were tokens of a life scattered inside. A strand of beads, a small stone knife chipped to a moon edge, a roll of cedar bark. The elder asked her to kneel. She dabbed smoke from the cedar at the woman's forehead. Then the elder pressed the beads into her hand, said the words of a blessing that sounded like river water slipping over stones. When the blessing ended, the elder's posture stiffened. She looked toward the mouth of the cave, and her voice lost its softness. Others are climbing. You are not the only one who hears the drums far below. The stranger from town had found the lower switchbacks and was making his way up. He rode with his reins loose and his eyes on the shadows. Behind him, 2 riders from the survey crew followed at a distance. They carried no rifles in the open, but their saddlebags were heavy. The boss had told them to check on rumors and take notes on routes. The stranger did not trust them with notes or routes. He paused at a shelf to study the track of boots and a single set of soft steps that were lighter than his own. He pushed on with a knot in his gut. Back in town, a second subplot took shape. The boarding house woman, tired and kind, pinned a paper to the wall behind her front desk. It was a notice from the marshal about the rail spur and the rights of the company. She had seen notices like it before and knew how such words might turn a quiet valley into a hard place. She packed a small bag with bread, coffee, and a blanket, and told her son to mind the rooms. Then she walked to the small chapel at the end of the lane and lit a candle for those who would walk these hills before any deed was inked. She spoke a prayer without fancy words. It was a prayer for mercy, for patience, and for a way to keep people from tearing what they could not rebuild. On the mountain, the elder and the younger stepped out from the cave and watched the sky begin to drain of color. The elder showed her the path up to a saddle, where the wind moved in a low, constant note. There, the elder said, the drums would be heard as a lesson rather than a warning. But before they could reach the saddle, a figure slid from behind a rock. It was a boy from town, the same one who sold jerky. He had followed the stranger and then slipped past him. His face was pale with a kind of brave fear. He told them men were coming with stakes and maps. He said the crew planned to sleep at the base of the ridge and climb at first light to set the first iron marker. The elder's mouth hardened. The younger felt a steady heat rise in her chest. Sacred ground did not need to shout to be heard. But sometimes people would not listen unless the ground spoke in more than whispers. The stranger reached them a short time later, breathless and grateful to see the boy safe. He took in the elder's silent appraisal, then turned to the woman and spoke quickly. The company believed the ridge hid copper and a shortcut to the water. They would not back away from a line drawn on a map. The marshal would be on their side. But he also said that men could be turned with the right witness. If the company were shown that work on this ridge would cost more than they could afford, they might shift the spur to the east. He did not mean a fight. He meant a showing. A night where the mountain spoke for itself with a voice no ledger could tame. The elder studied him. You speak like someone who has watched a line cut a home in half, she said. The stranger looked away. He had seen a valley in the north lose its spring to a pipe and watched families move, because the water had been signed over on a page. He had taken the job of moving cattle for the crew and had not slept well since. The elder nodded as if she had heard the confession that stayed behind his teeth. Then she turned to the woman who carried the carvings. The time has come for you to call what was promised, she said. The drums will answer if the vow is clean. If it is not clean, the wind will die. They climbed to the saddle as twilight set like a warm cloth across the heights. The boy sat with the stranger near the path, watching for the 2 riders below. The elder and the woman placed the carvings on a flat stone and folded their hands in their laps. The woman began to speak the words as she remembered them: the vow by the river, promise by the fire, the oath held in the voice of the Apache chief. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She let the words settle in the air with the weight of truth. At first, nothing moved. Then a single raven cut a slow circle above them. The wind changed. Somewhere in the stone a low tone began to hum. It grew into a rhythm that did not come from hands on drums, but from the body of the mountain itself. The elder's face softened with relief. The woman closed her eyes and felt her heartbeat fall into the same rhythm. In that rhythm, she sensed other heartbeats, near and far, living and gone. She sensed the chief like a presence stepping through a curtain, steady and sure. The 2 riders from the crew reached the lower ledge and stopped. The sound pressed against them like a warm wall. They were not superstitious men, but they were not fools either. One made a sign without meaning to. The other swallowed hard and said they should come back at dawn with the others. They eased their horses back down the switchback, eyes fixed on the dark, as if something might step out and take their courage by the collar. The stranger let out a slow breath. The boy grinned and then looked ashamed of the fear he had felt. The elder put a hand on the woman's shoulder and whispered that this was only the first voice of the stone. The second voice would be stronger if the vow was shared by more than two. The woman understood. A legacy that lived within a person could begin in blood or begin in choice. Either way, it required a community to stand with it. When the rhythm faded, the elder led them to a narrow camp in the rocks. They ate bread and drank water while the stars thickened. Far below, the crew's fires pricked the dark near the base of the ridge. The stranger said the boss would not back away without a counterweight. He would call in the marshal and gather signatures from townspeople who wanted wages. The woman stared at the glowing dots and felt the old fear try to climb back into her throat. She knew some in town would sign whatever was put in front of them. Hunger and hope were close cousins. The elder smiled without mirth. Then we give them another kind of hope, she said. We let them see life that money cannot replace. She told the boy to carry a message at first light to the boarding house woman. Ask her to bring 2 elders from the church, a school teacher, and 3 mothers who fetch water from the creek. Ask them to walk to the foot of the ridge. Ask them to listen. The boy nodded, eager for a task. He asked what he should say if the marshal stopped him on the road. Tell him you are delivering a prayer, the elder said. Even the law cannot arrest a prayer. The night thinned toward morning. In the stillness before dawn, the woman dreamed she stood again at the river where she had once cut the chief free. He did not speak. He pressed her hand to his chest and looked past her toward the mountains. In the dream, the mountains breathed like sleeping beasts. She woke with the taste of river water on her tongue and the sense that time was folding. At first light, the boy slipped down a deer path and vanished into the foothills. The stranger saddled his horse and rode to shadow the crew in case they tried the ledge again. The elder and the woman climbed back to the saddle and laid the carvings on the stone. The wind carried voices from below, men moving, animals restless, a hammer ringing against a stake. The mountain gathered itself around the sounds, silent and watchful, as if it waited to see which kind of promise would be kept when the sun reached the line of the ridge. Morning broke over the ridge, with a pale gold light that crept slowly down the mountainside. The woman stood at the saddle where the carvings lay, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. The valley below was quiet, except for the faint clang of metal where the survey crew had camped. She could see their tents scattered along the creek like white stones. The elder beside her moved with calm certainty, her gaze steady on the horizon. When the sun reaches the line of those oaks, she said, the mountain will speak again. The people must already be on their way. Down in the foothills, the boy ran barefoot through the early mist. The message he carried had already begun to travel faster than his steps. The boarding house woman had found the teacher and the 2 elders from the church. She told them about the mountain, about the drums, and about a vow that still echoed in the land. Some hesitated, but something in her tone, a mixture of reverence and quiet fear, convinced them. By the time the boy reached the crossroads, a small group had gathered, walking in silence toward the ridge. Word spread from porch to porch, and soon more followed, men who worked the stables, women who fetched water, and even the blacksmith who had built the first gate in town. None knew exactly why they were going, but all felt drawn by a force they couldn't name. The stranger rode beside the group, his face marked by sleeplessness. The 2 riders from the company had reported what they'd heard, that the mountain had begun to hum like thunder. The boss had laughed at first, but when his horse refused to move toward the ridge, he grew pale. He had ridden into the valley himself that morning, carrying the official deed that gave the company rights to dig and divert the creek. He was a man who believed in law, not legend, but as the sun rose, the stillness of the land began to unsettle him. The birds had gone quiet. Even the horses stood uneasy. Up on the ridge, the woman touched the carvings once more. The feather she had carried since the storm rested beside them, its black edge now streaked with light. The elder knelt and spoke words in the old language, the syllables low and musical. The mountains seemed to listen. A faint wind rose from the east, curling through the stones like a breath. The woman closed her eyes and repeated the vow, not as a memory, but as a declaration. We will be together again and again, until the legacy lives within me. The sound of her voice carried into the valley, soft but clear, and those who were climbing felt it as a tremor in their bones. The first group of townspeople reached the foot of the ridge as the sun struck the oaks. They saw the woman standing high above, the elder beside her, and the carvings shining faintly in the light. The boss dismounted and called out, his voice echoing against the rock. "This land is claimed by law," he shouted. "You can't stop what's been signed." But as he spoke, the ground beneath him began to pulse with a low rhythm, the same deep sound that had frightened the men the night before. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't the earth cracking. It was something older, something alive. The people looked at one another in silence. The teacher clutched her shawl, the elders crossed themselves, and the blacksmith whispered a prayer. Then the wind shifted, and from the mountain came a sound like many drums beating as one. The rhythm grew stronger, vibrating through the soil and into their feet. The woman on the ridge raised her hands. She was not summoning, she was remembering. The mountain answered with light, a glow that spread from the carvings outward, tracing the old symbols along the rock until the entire ridge seemed alive with faint fire. The boss fell to his knees, his papers scattering in the wind. The stranger took off his hat, head bowed, as the elder spoke again in the old tongue. For a long moment, no one moved. The air shimmered, and those standing below thought they saw a figure beside the woman, tall, bare-chested, hair braided with feathers. The outline flickered like heat above stone. Some said it was a trick of the light. Others swore they saw his hand resting gently on her shoulder. When the glow faded, the mountain fell silent again, and the wind died completely. The boss rose slowly, his face ashen. He looked at the papers at his feet, then at the crowd, then at the ridge. "We'll move the line," he said hoarsely. "The ridge isn't ours to touch." Turned to the stranger, voice trembling. "You'll help me file the new claim." The stranger nodded, knowing this decision would cost the man his position but save his soul from something worse. The elder smiled faintly and turned to the woman. "It is done," she said. The promise kept its own weight. The woman felt a warmth spread through her chest, not like heat but like peace. She looked toward the valley and saw the people starting to kneel, not out of worship, but out of respect. In that moment, she understood that the legacy wasn't just in blood. It was in witness. Those who had seen this day would remember it, and through them, the chief's promise would live on. By sunset, the ridge was quiet again. The crowd had gone, the elder had returned to her small home beyond the creek, and only the woman remained. She built a small fire near the carvings and watched the flames twist in the cooling air. The feather lay in her hand, black and gold, its tip faintly glowing. She spoke softly into the smoke. "You kept your word," she whispered. "And so will I." When she woke the next morning, the fire had burned out, but the carvings gleamed as if newly made. She packed her few things and began the slow walk down the trail. The town below felt different, not newer, not richer, but quieter, as if something restless had finally found rest. People nodded when she passed, some with gratitude, others with wonder. The boarding house woman offered her bread and a cup of water. The boy who had carried the message followed her to the gate and asked if the mountain would speak again. She smiled and touched his hair. "Only if we forget to listen," she said. Years passed, and the story of that day spread like wind through the valley. The rail spur was built farther east, away from the sacred ridge. The creek flowed untouched, feeding the fields that grew green again after long drought. Travelers who came west heard whispers about the mountain that sang, though few could say exactly what had happened there. Some said the woman had vanished into the hills. Others said she still lived by the spring, tending a small garden of sage and corn. In truth, she stayed near the place where her journey began, in the same cabin by the creek. Time weathered her hair and lined her hands, but her eyes held the same steady fire. She kept the carvings on her mantle and the feather above her door. Sometimes when the wind turned warm, she would hear the faint beat of drums rolling down from the ridge. Then she would close her eyes and whisper the words once more, not as a prayer but as a memory of love and duty that outlasted both war and time. The stranger visited often. He had taken work as a bridge warden, guiding travelers across the valley. They shared quiet meals and long talks, neither speaking much about the day the mountain sang. He knew she had chosen her path, and he carried his own purpose in making sure the land stayed as it was. They never called what they had love in the way most people did, but theirs was the kind that grew from trust and silence, the kind that belonged to the living rather than the past. When the elder passed away, the woman buried her on the ridge beneath the cottonwoods. She marked the grave with a single stone and laid the black feather beside it. Standing there, she felt the mountain breathe once more, the rhythm soft and slow, like the pulse of something eternal. She whispered a thank you to the wind and let it carry her words across the valley. Many seasons later, when her own time drew near, she returned to the ridge one last time. The spring still ran clear, the air still carried the scent of sage, and the carvings still glowed faintly at dusk. She sat by the same stone and closed her eyes. The mountain hummed low, as if greeting an old friend. And then she heard his voice, the same voice that had once whispered to her beside a fire long ago. "We will be together again and again," it said, warm and sure, "until my legacy lives within you." When the townsfolk found her days later, she was resting peacefully. Her hands folded over the carvings, her face calm as if in sleep. They buried her beside the elder, where the grass grew tall and the wind never stopped moving. No marker was set, only a simple band of stones arranged in a circle. From then on, each spring, a new black feather would appear there, though no one knew how. The legend of the Apache chief and the woman who heard the mountain's heart became part of the valley's story. Some told it as a tale of love, others as a reminder that promises made with truth never fade. But those who had seen the ridge that day understood it differently. They knew that legacy was not written on stone or signed in ink. It lived in those who remembered to listen to the land, to the wind, and to the quiet vow that still echoed through the mountains when the sun fell low and the world held its breath.